She placed that wedding invitation on my doormat like a verdict, the gold trim and the careful handwriting saying more than any message ever could. And when I opened the envelope and read the neat lines that invited me to witness her triumph, I felt the weight of an intended humiliation settle across my chest the way a stone settles at the bottom of a river, slow and irreversible. And instead of answering with the kind of outrage people expect, I made a quiet decision. I would go, I would not shout, and I would not perform. I would arrive with a calm that made the spectacle impossible to stage because rage needs an audience, and I refused to let her script the room. I rented a black limousine because I wanted the moment to speak with simplicity rather than spectacle. I bought a suit that fit as if it were a second skin so my body would not betray nervousness, and I rehearsed small, neutral faces in the mirror until my expression felt controlled enough to be effective. Because there is a particular level of danger in having no outward reaction when everyone else is expecting a collapse, and she had clearly planned her night to harvest that collapse in front of friends. When the car pulled up and I stepped out beneath the soft chandelier light, people turned, and the noise of conversations folded around me like a hush, and I watched Melissa's smile, practiced and perfect, wobble for a fraction of a breath in a way that felt like the first private victory of the evening, even though outwardly nothing dramatic had yet occurred. I moved through small groups with ordinary questions about travel, about where the bride's sister bought her shoes, about the weather. Because ordinary chat loosens tongues and makes memory spill the unscripted details that polite speeches tidy away. And as I listened, I started to collect little contradictions that did not fit her glossy version of events. The kind of small facts that make a neat story collapse. A hurried engagement mentioned with nervous laughter. A groomsman who avoided making eye contact when timelines came up. A cousin who spoke too freely after a glass too many and said, "They moved so quickly, didn't they? Weeks, not months." The phrase landing in the room like a pebble dropped into still water and making everyone glance at everyone else to see who had heard the splash. When Melissa threaded a barb about my past into a toast, delivered with that cold, satisfied laugh she keeps for public moments, I answered in the tone of someone asking a genuine question rather than throwing an accusation, and I said, "Don't you think people remember chapters of a life differently when they tell them to others?" And the question worked like an incision. An older woman whom everyone respected shrugged, and then, with slow candor, told a piece of memory she had not realized mattered, mentioning whispers she had heard about something used to accelerate a decision, and that single word, pregnancy, did not explode but hung in the air like a scent everyone could suddenly identify, subtle and undeniable. The first twist of the evening revealed itself not because I engineered a spectacle, but because truth has the gravity of its own and will draw loose confessions toward it if you give those confessions a place to land. The overlapping timeline came into view like a watermark when some guests began to realize that Daniel and Melissa had not been discreet acquaintances before our breakup, but had spent time together while I was still part of the life she now framed as old and small, and you could see the shift in people's faces as the comfortable narrative they were being handed required revision. I chose not to rise and denounce her in the microphone because I prefer the economy of letting the truth do the work. And there is a particular cruelty in silence that forces others to fill it with their own reconsiderations. So I sat with my drink, let the facts speak through ordinary chatter, and watched as the carefully composed evening began to look less like a triumph and more like an assembly of patched stories. And in that quiet witnessing, I felt a satisfaction that was not about making her suffer for suffering's sake, but about restoring balance with the slow, surgical effectiveness of a fact placed precisely where it would do the most structural harm to a lie. The ride to the venue stretched out like a performance in itself, the limousine humming beneath me while the tinted glass turned the world outside into a blur of lights and vague silhouettes. And in that suspended silence, I felt the strange combination of dread and anticipation tightening in my stomach. I wasn't just going to a wedding. I was walking straight into an ambush that had been designed for me. And instead of showing up like the wounded guest of honor, I intended to arrive as the unexpected variable she had no way to control. My driver asked if I wanted music, but I shook my head because the hum of the engine and the rhythm of my own breathing felt like the only soundtrack I could stand, and I kept my eyes on the reflection in the dark glass, adjusting my tie, memorizing the way calmness should look, reminding myself again and again that a steady hand is sharper than a sword. As we rolled closer, I thought about the mechanics of humiliation and how Melissa had always needed a stage to perform her victories, how she couldn't simply move on quietly, but had to choreograph every goodbye into a spectacle. That thought didn't sting anymore. It fueled me, because knowing her patterns gave me a blueprint for dismantling them. I pictured her face rehearsing the exact smirk she planned to wear when she saw me walk in alone, and I felt the corners of my mouth twitch as I imagined replacing that smirk with confusion, just enough to unravel her rhythm. A limousine doesn't scream desperation. It whispers composure, and I knew that subtle difference would dig deeper than any loud declaration of defiance could. When we pulled into the long driveway lined with lanterns, I caught sight of groups of guests gathering near the entrance, and I saw how their heads turned at the sleek black car, their conversations pausing in mid-sentence the way a record skips. That was the first ripple. When the driver opened my door and I stepped out, the second ripple followed, and I could feel eyes crawling across the fabric of my suit, registering the shine of polished shoes, registering that I was not the man she had promised them I would be. Melissa herself was standing near the entrance, surrounded by bridesmaids, and when our eyes locked, the air between us felt sharp. Her smile stretched, but it wavered for just a second, and that tiny falter felt like the first stone loosened from the dam. I walked in slowly, deliberately, greeting people with calm nods and polite words, and the whispers grew louder behind me, the way dry leaves rustle in a hidden breeze. I heard one woman whisper that I looked better than ever, another laugh nervously and say she had expected me to be broken, and each remark was like a stitch unraveling in the fabric of Melissa's story. I didn't need to shout or explain myself. My presence was already rewriting the narrative she had built, and I could see her glancing toward Daniel, her new husband, who shifted uneasily in his suit, as though he already sensed that the room was not bending the way she had promised him it would. Inside the reception hall, the chandeliers cast golden light over everything, making the scene feel too polished, almost theatrical, and I knew that meant it was vulnerable, because the more effort someone puts into appearances, the easier it is for one hairline crack to expose the whole fragile structure. I made small talk with people I hadn't seen in years, listening carefully, never rushing, and in their casual remarks I found hints of tension, mentions of how fast the engagement had been, jokes about Melissa always needing to win, comments that carried the weight of unease beneath their surface. I collected those fragments quietly, arranging them in my mind the way an architect gathers beams before constructing a frame, because I knew I would need them later when the night bent toward confrontation. And then came the toast. Melissa stood at the head table with her champagne glass raised, her voice loud and ringing, and she made a comment so rehearsed it almost sounded rehearsed badly. Some people just don't know how to hold on to good things, but thankfully I found someone who does. Laughter scattered across the room, some nervous, some genuine, and all eyes turned toward me because everyone understood the target of her words. My heart pounded once, hard, but I steadied my breath, raised my own glass slightly, and answered not with bitterness but with a tone as calm as a surgeon's hand. Funny how timelines overlap when memories get rewritten for the audience, I said, my voice measured, almost casual, and for a moment the room went silent in that uncomfortable way when people realize they've heard something sharp, but they aren't sure how to respond. Daniel's jaw tightened. Melissa's fingers clenched around her glass, the smile fixed, but her eyes betraying the first flicker of panic. That was the beginning of the unraveling, and I knew the night was mine. The silence that followed my words clung to the air like smoke after a match is struck, faint but impossible to ignore. And while glasses clinked and conversations stumbled back in emotion, I saw the way eyes flickered between me, Melissa, and Daniel, as if everyone had suddenly realized there was more beneath the polished stage than the bride wanted them to see. I leaned back in my chair and let the discomfort breathe, because silence can be louder than accusation, and I watched Daniel's throat tighten as he tried to force a laugh that didn't quite land. Melissa leaned toward him, her hand curling around his arm, her lips moving in a whisper too low to catch, but I saw the sharpness in her jawline, the kind of expression she used to wear when she felt a grip slipping. She had expected me to sit quietly in the corner, diminished and small, but the moment I showed calm defiance her balance tilted, and she was scrambling to catch herself without letting the guests see it. She raised her glass again, made another quip about moving on to better things. And some people laughed politely, but others didn't, because once a mask slips even for a second, the cracks stay visible no matter how quickly you try to smooth them over. I moved from table to table as the evening stretched on, never lingering long, just enough to exchange polite words, just enough to leave people unsettled by how composed I looked. Each time I walked away, I heard murmurs starting behind me, quiet comments about how unexpected it was, how Melissa hadn't described me this way, how Daniel seemed oddly distracted. The narrative she had been writing for months was collapsing in real time, undone by nothing more than my steady presence. And that collapse was sweeter than any outburst could have been. At one point, I caught Daniel's reflection in the mirror behind the bar. He was staring at me while pretending to sip his drink, his eyes restless, his jaw locked tight. When our gazes met in that glass, he looked away instantly. And in that second, I knew there was something more at work than jealousy or discomfort. It wasn't just that I was there. It was that my presence reminded him of something he couldn't quite bury, and the thought lodged in my chest like a seed of suspicion. Later, as I stood by the edge of the dance floor watching couples sway beneath the chandeliers, Melissa approached me with the kind of forced smile that always precedes venom. "I hope you're enjoying yourself," she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness, "though I imagine it must feel strange being here." Her eyes searched mine, waiting for a crack. I gave her none. "It doesn't feel strange at all," I replied, swirling the wine in my glass slowly. "But I wonder, does it feel strange for him?" I tilted my head slightly toward Daniel, who was across the room speaking with a cluster of relatives, but clearly stealing glances at us, his shoulders stiff, his posture defensive. Melissa's smile froze, the faintest twitch betraying her composure, and for a flicker of a second her pupils widened, as if she'd been caught off guard by the implication. She recovered quickly, laughing lightly, but the laugh had no warmth, and she excused herself with a sharp turn that felt more like retreat than grace. The hours wore on, and the celebration grew louder, but beneath the surface hum there was tension like a live wire running through the room. Guests spoke in quieter tones when Melissa passed, and Daniel seemed unable to stop scanning the crowd, as if searching for someone he hoped wouldn't appear. When I brushed past a tipsy cousin near the dessert table, he slurred a half-whisper that stuck in my mind like a thorn. "Crazy how quick they jumped into this. You'd think secrets could wait until after the honeymoon." He laughed at his own words, oblivious to their weight, but I caught them, stored them, and felt the pieces beginning to assemble into something larger. By the time I returned to my seat, I could feel Melissa's irritation pulsing across the room like heat. She wanted me broken, and instead I was becoming the shadow hanging over her perfect night, the presence she couldn't silence. Every time she tried to steer attention back to herself, someone's eyes flicked toward me, measuring me against the story she had fed them, and realizing the story no longer held. I sipped my drink, leaned back in my chair, and allowed the evening to keep unraveling on its own. Because revenge isn't always about the blow you deliver. It's about the unease you plant and the silence you refuse to break. The dance floor turned slowly like a carousel of polite lies, and while the band slid from one familiar song to the next, I felt the temperature of the room change in subtle degrees, the way a storm gathers without thunder, because every glance had begun to carry a question, and every laugh sounded a half note too high. I stood near the bar and let the evening pass over me until a bridesmaid with dark eyes and a dress that caught the light like water brushed my sleeve and asked if I wanted anything stronger than wine, her perfume landing with a soft weight that made memory and caution wrestle in my chest. And even as I told her I was fine, I felt that pull of attraction sharpen the edges of everything, not as a distraction, but as a reminder that bodies speak even when words lie. She leaned in to hear me over the music, and her collarbone lifted as she laughed. And when her hand rested on my wrist for a heartbeat more than polite, I saw Melissa watching from across the room with a smile that was all teeth. And I realized the best way to knock over a stage is not to shout at the actor, but to call a light on the rigging. So I asked the bridesmaid, whose name I learned was Talia, how long she had known Daniel. And she answered with a measured little shrug that told me she liked him fine and liked Melissa less. And then in a tone that pretended to be careless, she added that people had said the engagement was the fastest they had ever seen, and that some stories don't need a calendar to sound suspicious, which was exactly the kind of unclaimed sentence I was collecting. I thanked her and slid away before curiosity became the story, because I needed friction, not scandal, and the place to find it was the corner where two uncles argued about football with the casual cruelty families save for one another. I stood between them smiling like a man who had come for cake. And when a younger cousin staggered over with whiskey bright in his eyes, I steadied his elbow and listened as he bragged that he knew everything about how quickly love could change shape, and that Daniel had been around so much last winter people thought he lived at Melissa's place. And when I asked, not as an accusation, but as a tired man asking for clarity, last winter as in before the breakup or after, he squinted as if the room were tilting and said the word before too loudly, then corrected himself and tried to laugh it off. The laugh died when an ant cleared her throat, because a simple word can weigh more than a speech, and the unease spread like spilled wine under a bright tablecloth. I didn't smile. I only nodded slowly, then crossed the floor toward the photo booth where Daniel had stationed himself behind a wall of cousins, because men in trouble often build walls of other people and call it company. He saw me coming and his mouth moved into something like a grin, but his eyes asked me not to speak, which made me speak softer, and I said in a careful voice that sounded like I was protecting us both, "After your vows, could we take 2 minutes somewhere quiet? There's a timeline detail I need to put to bed." And he tried to joke that timelines were for accountants, yet his knuckles went white around his glass, and he finally whispered, "This is her night, don't start." And I answered that I hadn't started anything, that I was only deciding whether to finish something, and he swallowed so hard I could hear it under the music. I moved on before he could decide to call security or courage, and I found Melissa near the cake pretending to consult the florist about flowers that were already wired in place. And when I stepped close, she smelled like the expensive vanilla she always wore when she wanted a room to believe her innocence, and the old ache of being pulled by that softness rose, like a dangerous tide that carries memories of heat and whispers, and the kind of S** that tries to masquerade as love, but beneath it I kept my footing because I'd learned that longing is a trick mirror. I told her, in the gentlest tone I possessed, that if she needed to fix anything tonight, she should do it now before fixing became losing, and she smiled wide, too bright, and said I was projecting bitterness, then added for the benefit of the maid of honor who hovered nearby that she had never looked back, not once, and Daniel had rescued her from a relationship that was going nowhere, which might have landed if I hadn't. Watched her gaze flick sideways toward the doors as if she expected someone to walk through them and shatter the room, and when I murmured, "If he shows up, I won't have to say a word," she blinked, misread me, and snapped that my threats were pathetic, and I told her they weren't threats, they were weather reports. She tried to spike me with a line about how some men don't understand what it means to keep a good thing, and I let the insult land without flinching, then leaned closer so only she could hear, and said, "You told me once that lies are just stories timed better than the truth. I think your timing ran out." She flinched despite herself, and the tiny movement felt like the thread I had been searching for finally pulling free. I stepped back, let the band swell, and resolved that when the next song ended I would ask the DJ for the microphone, not to confess or accuse, but to toast honestly to happy couples who begin without shadows, a sentence simple enough to look harmless and sharp enough to cut. And as I looked across the room at Daniel, whose shoulders had rounded into the posture of a man, preparing for impact, I knew the first twist would not need me to push it, only to name it when it arrived. The microphone in my hand felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of the silence that dropped when the DJ passed it to me, a silence that thickened under the chandeliers like fog in a valley. I could feel Melissa's eyes drilling into me, a warning wrapped in a smile, and I could see Daniel stiffen in his chair as if bracing for a blow he couldn't quite predict. I raised my glass and spoke slowly, letting each word settle. Here's to couples who begin without shadows, who start fresh, who know the strength of honesty. On the surface it sounded like a blessing, but every syllable carried a blade beneath it, and the room heard the metal even if they pretended they didn't. For a heartbeat nobody moved, then a few glasses lifted, and the applause was polite but shallow, as if people were unsure whether they were clapping for a toast or for the end of a performance. Melissa clapped too, her smile stretched, but the skin around her eyes was tight, and Daniel's hand trembled when he set his glass down. I handed the microphone back, walked off the stage, and the music resumed, but the shift had already happened. People leaned closer to one another now, whispering in low tones that had nothing to do with the playlist. As I moved back through the crowd, I overheard a bridesmaid mutter, "What does he mean by shadows?" And a cousin reply, "Ask anyone who was around last winter," before catching himself and going pale. These weren't my words anymore. They were theirs, and once gossip escapes, it doesn't return to its cage. I only needed to watch. Melissa cornered me near the bar not long after, her perfume sharp, her voice low enough to sound private, but pitched so others nearby could catch fragments. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed, dragging dirt into my wedding, trying to make me look like a fool. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I sipped my drink slowly, met her gaze without blinking, and let her frustration fill the silence until it was unbearable. Finally, I said, "If there's no dirt, nothing sticks. But if there is, you should be worried about who brings it up next, because it won't be me." Her mouth tightened, and for a moment I thought she might explode. But then she caught sight of her aunt watching us from across the room and forced a laugh, patting my shoulder as if we'd just shared a private joke. "Always so dramatic," she said loudly, and then swept away with her dress trailing like smoke. But the act was cracked now, and once cracks appear, the light gets in. Daniel avoided me for the rest of the evening, which in itself was a statement. He danced with Melissa, but never looked at her face, only at the floor, as if counting the steps kept him from unraveling. During dinner, he excused himself twice, returning each time more flushed, more distracted, and once I caught him in the hallway gripping the edge of a table, breathing like a man carrying a weight that would break him if he didn't set it down soon. When he noticed me, he straightened, forced a grin, and muttered, "Enjoying yourself?" His tone was brittle. I answered, "Immensely," because it was true, not in the shallow sense of enjoying food or music, but in the deeper satisfaction of watching lies begin to corrode under their own acid. The real moment came later, when the cake had been cut and the photographer was lining people up for staged laughter. A guest who'd clearly had too much wine leaned toward me, her words slurring but her intent sharp. "Funny how Daniel was always around before the breakup, isn't it? People forget how fast tongues wag in small circles." She chuckled and nearly spilled her drink, but the damage was done. Two men nearby heard her and exchanged glances that were anything but innocent. Within minutes, the ripple spread. Questions rose, half-whispered timelines overlapped, and the neat story Melissa had presented began to look less like destiny and more like overlap. I didn't push further. I didn't need to. A good revenge doesn't require shouting, it requires patience. I stood back, let the whispers grow into currents, and when Melissa caught my eye from across the room, her smile gone now, her jaw set tight, I tilted my glass toward her in the faintest gesture of acknowledgement. The first cracks were showing, and the walls she built were beginning to bend. That night wasn't about exposing everything at once. It was about loosening the foundations until they couldn't hold. And judging by the unease that grew in every corner of that hall, the foundation had already begun to crumble. The strange thing about gossip is how it changes shape once the first person dares to speak it out loud. Because by the time dessert was being cleared, the whispers had grown legs, running faster than the servers carrying trays, and I could feel the shift in the room as easily as feeling a draft through a broken window. Where earlier conversations had been shallow and polite, now heads bent closer together, voices lowered, and glances flicked toward Melissa and Daniel with a weight that made the air thicker. I drifted among them quietly, careful not to look like I was listening, but my ears caught more than enough. She was already seeing him, wasn't she? I remember when he was at her apartment before she even left Ethan. It all happened too fast. Each fragment was like a brick dislodging from the neat wall Melissa had tried to build, and though she couldn't hear every word, she could sense the pressure. Her laugh came sharper, her posture more rigid, and each attempt at charm landed flatter than the last. Daniel, on the other hand, looked like a man unraveling by degrees. His tie had been loosened, his hair damp from sweat that had nothing to do with the heat of the room, and when I passed him near the doors, he muttered something that sounded almost like a plea. "You didn't need to come here." I stopped, turned slightly, and asked, "Didn't I? Seems like I'm not the one people are questioning." His face tightened, his lips forming words he swallowed before they could escape, and the silence between us told me more than any confession could. He knew. He knew the truth was leaking into the room, and he couldn't contain it. Melissa must have sensed it too, because she tried to seize the microphone again, making another toast about true love finding its way despite obstacles. But her voice cracked halfway through, and instead of applause she got scattered clapping, uneven and hesitant, like people performing politeness out of habit rather than belief. I stood at the back, arms crossed, and let the moment collapse on its own. The more she tried to control the narrative, the more brittle it became. What I didn't expect, though, was the subtle electricity building between me and Talia, the bridesmaid who had spoken with me earlier. She appeared again by my side, offering another glass of wine, her eyes searching mine with a mixture of curiosity and something warmer. "You don't look like a man who's losing," she said, her tone half-joking but edged with sincerity. I held her gaze longer than I should have, noticing the way her lips curved, the tilt of her head, the faint brush of her arm against mine. For a moment, desire stirred under the weight of revenge, reminding me that Melissa no longer owned any part of me, not even that. I didn't act on it, but the awareness was there, humming beneath the surface, and I knew Melissa noticed too because her eyes darted toward us more than once, her jaw tightening each time. The real blow of the night came not from me, but from a slip of the tongue by someone too careless with alcohol. At one table, a guest loudly recalled seeing Melissa and Daniel together at a holiday party months before the breakup, insisting they looked too close for comfort. Another chimed in, adding they'd thought it was odd at the time. The words hung in the air like smoke, spreading quickly, and within minutes the story twisted into a consensus. Melissa hadn't simply moved on fast, she'd overlapped, and everyone knew what that meant. She tried to laugh it off, to say people misremember, but memory has its own gravity once it's spoken, and denial only made her look more desperate. I didn't raise my voice, didn't reveal anything new, didn't need to. I simply walked slowly to the bar, ordered a drink, and let people see the calm on my face. That calm did more damage than any accusation, because it told the guests I wasn't surprised, that I'd known all along, and that they were only just catching up. Melissa shot daggers at me from across the room, but each one bounced off the silence I carried like armor. Daniel avoided my gaze entirely, his hand tightening on his glass until I thought it might shatter. By the time the band began another slow song, the celebration had transformed into something else entirely. It wasn't joy anymore. It was theater, strained and cracking. The bride and groom danced stiffly while guests whispered along the edges, and I leaned back in my chair with the quiet certainty that the night was tilting toward collapse. The rumors had turned sharp, and once sharp, they cut on their own. The band shifted into a glossier number, and the lights dipped to that soft honeytone venues use when they want everything to look forgiving. But forgiveness had already left the building, because the murmur had become a weather system of its own, and I could feel the pressure change with every step I took across the parquet floor. I chose a route that took me past groups who had already decided they preferred me to the story told about me, and I let my pace slow just enough that people could catch my sleeve with a question and pretend it was nothing. And when one uncle asked in the tone of a man who thinks he's being kind whether I was coping all right, I met his gaze and told him that coping is easy once truth stops arguing, then thanked him with a calm that made two other guests turn and listen harder. Melissa watched all of it from the head table with the rigid serenity of a statue trying not to crack, and Daniel tried to look like a groom in love while his eyes kept sliding to the exits as if the doors themselves owed him a rescue. When I reached the bar, the bartender asked whether I wanted the same, and I told him yes, but slower. And while he poured, I let the mirrored back wall show me the whole room at once, the bridesmaids whispering, the photographer lowering his camera between shots. Because the smiles kept failing, the maid of honor rehearsing comfort for a crisis that had not yet announced itself. Talia reappeared, a glint of silver at her throat catching the chandelier flare, and she stood so close our shoulders brushed, the contact small and electric in a way that reminded me I was alive in more ways than the narrow space revenge allows. And although this night wasn't about comfort, there was a gravity between us that neither of us tried to name. She asked what exactly I had meant by shadows in my toast, and I told her, in a voice that never rose above the music, that some Relationships begin with clean hands, and some begin with fingerprints all over the doorknob, and the difference matters when you switch on the light. She looked at me for a long moment, then said she had warned Melissa that moving so fast would make people count backwards, and I asked whether people had indeed started counting before tonight, and she nodded, saying that last winter had been loud with coincidences that repeated too often to be accidents, and that the stories Melissa told at brunch didn't always match the stories Daniel told when the men stepped outside to compare cigars they weren't going to light. The space between us tightened when a slow song started, and for a heartbeat we leaned toward the idea of stepping onto the floor, not for spectacle, but because bodies sometimes seek proof that betrayal hasn't poisoned every part of the future. And then I saw Melissa staring, a kind of brittle fury flickering behind her smile. And I told Talia it was wiser not to turn attraction into ammunition for someone else's war, which made her laugh at my caution and say that wisdom and desire rarely sign the same guest book. She squeezed my hand once, not a promise but a pulse, and drifted away with a look that said this story wasn't only about endings. I found Daniel alone near the service corridor pretending to check his messages while his thumb stayed frozen, and I stepped close enough that he could smell the quiet on me, then told him in the careful tone usually reserved for bad news that there is a difference between a rumor and a recollection, because rumors are light and die in daylight, while recollections come with names, places, and the way the air smelled when something happened. He told me to leave it alone because the night was almost over and we had both survived, and I told him nights do not end when the band packs up, but when the questions go to bed with answers, and that if he had one of those he should fetch it now before someone fetched it for him. He swallowed and tried to laugh, that thin laugh men use when the truth has started to burn through their pockets, and said that people move on, that adults make mistakes, that timing is messy, and I said that timing is arithmetic and people can count, and also that the room was already counting on its fingers. He asked whether I had come to blow things up, and I said I had come to watch the fuse he and Melissa had laid months ago finally reach its powder, and that the kindest thing he could do for his own future was step away from the microphone and stop trying to narrate against gravity. When I left him, I veered past the DJ and asked for a song that meant nothing to Melissa and everything to the older guests, because the safest way to widen a crack is to give people a tune they know by heart and space to talk while they sway. And as the floor filled with couples who weren't listening, the whispers thickened at the edges. By the time I reached my table again, a woman I recognized from their engagement party was telling another guest that the ring had appeared before the test result had, and that she had always thought the calendar looked off if anyone bothered to align the dates. And I watched the sentence settle like dust on polished glass and leave a mark that could not be brushed away. The tables truly turned then, not because I shouted, but because the room had chosen its own story, and Melissa could feel it because she stood, raised her glass, and launched into a speech about perseverance that had the tremble of someone offering reasons rather than gratitude. And somewhere behind me a door opened with the kind of hush a room hears even under music, and a late arrival stepped into the candlelight as if summoned by the collective doubt. And although I did not know her yet, I felt the narrative inhale in recognition, because sometimes the universe does the arithmetic for you and carries the remainder into the room at exactly the right moment. The band shifted into a glossier number, and the lights dipped to that soft honeytone venues use when they want everything to look forgiving. But forgiveness had already left the building, because the murmur had become a weather system of its own, and I could feel the pressure change with every step I took across the parquet floor. I chose a route that took me past groups who had already decided they preferred me to the story told about me, and I let my pace slow just enough that people could catch my sleeve with a question and pretend it was nothing. And when one uncle asked in the tone of a man who thinks he's being kind whether I was coping all right, I met his gaze and told him that coping is easy once truth stops arguing, then thanked him with a calm that made two other guests turn and listen harder. Melissa watched all of it from the head table with the rigid serenity of a statue trying not to crack, and Daniel tried to look like a groom in love while his eyes kept sliding to the exits as if the doors themselves owed him a rescue. When I reached the bar, the bartender asked whether I wanted the same, and I told him yes, but slower. And while he poured, I let the mirrored back wall show me the whole room at once, the bridesmaids whispering, the photographer lowering his camera between shots, because the smiles kept failing, the maid of honor rehearsing comfort for a crisis that had not yet announced itself. Talia reappeared, a glint of silver at her throat catching the chandelier flare, and she stood so close our shoulders brushed, the contact small and electric in a way that reminded me I was alive in more ways than the narrow space revenge allows. And although this night wasn't about comfort, there was a gravity between us that neither of us tried to name. She asked what exactly I had meant by shadows in my toast, and I told her, in a voice that never rose above the music, that some relationships begin with clean hands, and some begin with fingerprints all over the doorknob, and the difference matters when you switch on the light. She looked at me for a long moment, then said she had warned Melissa that moving so fast would make people count backwards, and I asked whether people had indeed started counting before tonight, and she nodded, saying that last winter had been loud with coincidences that repeated too often to be accidents, and that the stories Melissa told at brunch didn't always match the stories Daniel told when the men stepped outside to compare cigars they weren't going to light. The space between us tightened when a slow song started, and for a heartbeat we leaned toward the idea of stepping onto the floor, not for spectacle, but because bodies sometimes seek proof that betrayal hasn't poisoned every part of the future. And then I saw Melissa staring, a kind of brittle fury flickering behind her smile. And I told Talia it was wiser not to turn attraction into ammunition for someone else's war, which made her laugh at my caution and say that wisdom and desire rarely sign the same guest book. She squeezed my hand once, not a promise but a pulse, and drifted away with a look that said this story wasn't only about endings. I found Daniel alone near the service corridor pretending to check his messages while his thumb stayed frozen, and I stepped close enough that he could smell the quiet on me, then told him in the careful tone usually reserved for bad news that there is a difference between a rumor and a recollection, because rumors are light and die in daylight, while recollections come with names, places, and the way the air smelled when something happened. He told me to leave it alone because the night was almost over and we had both survived, and I told him nights do not end when the band packs up, but when the questions go to bed with answers, and that if he had one of those he should fetch it now before someone fetched it for him. He swallowed and tried to laugh that thin laugh men use when the truth has started to burn through their pockets, and said that people move on, that adults make mistakes, that timing is messy, and I said that timing is arithmetic and people can count, and also that the room was already counting on its fingers. He asked whether I had come to blow things up, and I said I had come to watch the fuse he and Melissa had laid months ago finally reach its powder, and that the kindest thing he could do for his own future was step away from the microphone and stop trying to narrate against gravity. When I left him, I veered past the DJ and asked for a song that meant nothing to Melissa and everything to the older guests, because the safest way to widen a crack is to give people a tune they know by heart and space to talk while they sway. And as the floor filled with couples who weren't listening, the whispers thickened at the edges. By the time I reached my table again, a woman I recognized from their engagement party was telling another guest that the ring had appeared before the test result had, and that she had always thought the calendar looked off if anyone bothered to align the dates. And I watched the sentence settle like dust on polished glass and leave a mark that could not be brushed away. The tables truly turned then, not because I shouted, but because the room had chosen its own story, and Melissa could feel it because she stood, raised her glass, and launched into a speech about perseverance that had the tremble of someone offering reasons rather than gratitude. And somewhere behind me a door opened with the kind of hush a room hears even under music, and a late arrival stepped into the candlelight as if summoned by the collective doubt. And although I did not know her yet, I felt the narrative inhale in recognition, because sometimes the universe does the arithmetic for you and carries the remainder into the room at exactly the right moment. The doors eased open in the middle of Melissa's shaky speech, and for a split second nobody noticed except me, because I had trained myself all night to watch the edges rather than the spotlight. A woman stepped inside, her dress travel-creased but elegant, her eyes sharp in a way that told me she hadn't come for wine or cake, but for something heavier. The room didn't turn right away, but once one guest gasped and whispered a name, the shift traveled like a current, and suddenly all the polite clapping and forced laughter fell quiet. Melissa faltered mid-sentence, her glass trembling in her hand, and Daniel froze so completely he looked carved out of stone. The woman walked forward with measured steps, not hurrying, not grandstanding, simply crossing the room with the confidence of someone who knew the floor was about to tilt beneath every foot. She stopped near the head table, her voice calm but clear enough to carry. I wasn't sure I'd do this tonight, but I realized silence would make me an accomplice. The words didn't need volume, because the hush was absolute. Daniel, you remember me. We were engaged until you left with her. And do you remember why you told me you had to end it? Because she told you she was pregnant. A collective intake of breath filled the hall like a sudden wind, napkins pressed to mouths, eyes darting from bride to groom and back again. The woman's voice sharpened just slightly. But there was no pregnancy, was there, Melissa? Only a story you needed him to believe. The glass slipped from Melissa's hand and shattered against the floor, champagne pooling around her shoes. And for the first time that night, she couldn't hold the mask. She tried to laugh, a high, brittle sound that cracked in the middle, but the silence that followed made it obvious the room wasn't buying it. Daniel's face collapsed in on itself, red flushing his cheeks, and his mouth opened, but no words emerged. He looked around, as though seeking an escape, but there was none. Every eye in the place was on him and the woman who had just pulled the curtain back. Melissa hissed, "You don't know what you're talking about," her voice shaking more with rage than fear, but the woman only lifted her chin and said, "I know enough. I know the timing. I know the lies. And now they all do too." She gestured to the guests, who had already begun their chorus of whispers. None of them hushed anymore. This wasn't rumor now. This was accusation, sharpened by context, spoken with the certainty of someone who had lived the fallout. The murmurs swelled into fragments of judgment. She tricked him. So that's how? I knew something didn't add up. Daniel pushed back his chair so violently it scraped across the floor, the sound slicing through the air. He faced Melissa, his voice hoarse but loud enough to cut through the crowd. "Tell me she's lying. Right now? Tell me she's making it up." His hands shook as he pointed toward the woman, his former fiancée, then back at his bride. Melissa's lips parted, but no words came. She looked like a trapped animal, darting her eyes from one corner of the room to the next, as if there might be some hidden door to run through. Finally she muttered. It was complicated, and that single phrase was enough to collapse everything she had built. The woman shook her head, her disappointment sharper than anger, then turned and left as swiftly as she had arrived. The doors closed behind her with a soft thud, but the sound landed like a gavel. Guests didn't even pretend to return to their seats. Clusters formed, voices rose, and the celebration dissolved into gossip and confrontation. A bridesmaid burst into tears. An uncle swore under his breath and walked out. The band played a few hesitant notes before stopping entirely, the music sounding obscene against the wreckage. Daniel's voice broke again, this time louder, directed at Melissa. "So you trapped me into this? All of it, every vow, every word, based on a lie?" He slammed his fist on the table, rattling plates and glasses, his rage spilling into the open. Melissa tried to grab his arm, to soothe him with the same touch she once used on me when she wanted control, but he yanked it away as if her skin burned. "Don't touch me. Don't you dare touch me." I watched from the back, quiet, my hands folded in front of me. I didn't need to add a word. The night had taken care of itself. The seed of suspicion planted hours ago had grown into a wildfire. People looked toward me occasionally, eyes widening as if realizing why my calm smile had never faltered, but I didn't return their stares for long. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about her collapse. Revenge isn't always a knife you drive in yourself. Sometimes it's the silence you maintain while the truth cuts on its own. Melissa's voice rose, frantic now, pleading and furious at once. "You don't understand, Daniel. I did what I had to do. You were going to leave me. I couldn't let you." She stopped herself, realizing too late what she had admitted, but the words had already settled into the air like poison. Guests shook their heads. Some muttered that they had wasted their evening, others that they'd never seen anything so shameful. Even her closest friends couldn't muster defense. They avoided her eyes, choosing instead to gather their things. Daniel shoved back from the table again and stormed toward the exit, pushing past relatives who tried to stop him. The bride, abandoned in front of everyone she had summoned to worship her victory, stood alone among the wreckage of cake crumbs and champagne stains, her dress no longer regal but desperate. She caught my eye across the room, her face twisted with fury, and shouted, "This is your fault. You came here to destroy me." I didn't move. I didn't answer. I just held her gaze with the calm of a man who had already won, because the truth was simple. I hadn't destroyed her. I'd only walked into the room and refused to play the fool. She had destroyed herself. The room held its breath the way a theater does after a line that can't be taken back, and in that hush I watched the scaffolding of Melissa's night creak and sway, because once the word complicated left her mouth it grew teeth, and the guests who had come for champagne and photographs suddenly found themselves witnesses to a confession disguised as a defense. Daniel staggered 2 steps from the head table, and then pivoted back with the dazed fury of a man who has just realized the ground. Beneath him is plywood painted to look like marble, and he demanded in a voice that cracked on every third word to know when exactly the lie had begun, whether the holiday party was already numbered, whether the whispered promise had ever been real, and Melissa answered with a staccato of denials so fast none of them landed, insisting it was fear, insisting it was love, insisting that a story borrowed for a week could be forgiven if the ending was beautiful enough, and the room told her with its silence that endings written on forged paper don't survive the rain. A chair toppled somewhere behind me, and a groomsman swore under his breath, and the band had that frozen look musicians get when the set list no longer applies to the night. And I stood very still at the back and let the wreckage wash over me like cold air after a fire door opens, because there is a steadiness that only arrives when outcomes stop negotiating and simply happen. Daniel's mother took 2 careful steps toward her son and placed a hand on his shoulder with the heartbreaking gentleness mothers say for moments when they can't fix the thing breaking. And he shrugged away, not out of cruelty, but because he needed to fail or stand on his own legs. And he turned to Melissa again and told her in a voice gone low and dangerous that marriage built on a staged emergency is not marriage, it's theater with matching rings. And she lunged for his hand as if contact could glue the porcelain back together. He pulled free with a movement that made the entire head table flinch, and when he asked whether there had ever been a test, a doctor, a date, anything but a whispered story in a living room at midnight, she said there had been fear and a calendar and a hope, and the words fell like wet matches. A bridesmaid tried to usher Melissa away from the center of the room the way handlers hustle a star backstage after a microphone malfunctions, but the movement only emphasized the spiral, because clusters of relatives were already collecting purses and jackets with the stiff efficiency people use when they want to leave without appearing to flee, and the photographer lowered his camera all the way this time, deciding perhaps that no album needs these frames. I felt Talia at my elbow before I saw her, the soft brush of her dress and the quick intake of breath that betrayed conflict, pity for a friend, anger at the deception, some streak of protective instinct that wanted to pull me out of the blast radius and also keep me in it long enough to see justice settle. She murmured that I didn't have to stay, and I told her I wasn't staying. I was finishing, which is different, because leaving before the truth lands is a private relief, and I wanted a public ending, the kind that changes the story people tell tomorrow. Across the room, Melissa spotted us, and her face warped into that expression she uses when jealousy overrides strategy. And for a moment, I felt the old, dangerous magnetism tug at me. The memory of warm skin and whispered promises, and the kind of S** that arrives like a truce and leaves like an invoice. But I stood where I was and let the pull pass, because yearning is not a reason, it's a reflex. When she screamed that I had come to ruin her, that I had dragged a stranger in off the street to perform a scene, several guests actually laughed, not because they were cruel, but because the accusation landed sideways on the truth everyone had just watched, and laughter can be a verdict when people are tired of lies. Daniel tried one last time to make sense of it, pleading now more than raging, as if a kinder story might still exist if he could coax it into the light. But Melissa kept offering shape without substance, and the air smelled like wilted flowers and spilled champagne, and there was no music to soften anything. He looked at me then, finally, as if I had become a mirror he couldn't avoid, and I met his gaze without triumph. I told him with the smallest shake of my head that this wasn't about me, not anymore, that I hadn't set the trap he was standing in, and something in his shoulders dropped, a surrender not to me, but to the obvious, and he said to the room rather than to her that the evening was over, and he walked out through the doors the woman had used moments earlier, leaving behind the weight of promises that had not survived their first hour. People began to spill after him in a hush that felt like snowfall, the kind that muffles sound and reveals footprints. And Melissa turned in a slow circle, as if the room might give her a cue she could still perform. When her eyes found mine again, she moved toward me with a fury that burned through the veneer of bridal grace. And she demanded I deny what the late arrival had said, demanded I admit I had orchestrated it, demanded anything she could swing like a weapon against the wall that had finally refused to hold her shadow. And I said nothing, because sometimes the only humane act is to withhold the lie someone begs you to lend them. I set my glass on the nearest table with a care that felt ceremonial, nodded once to Talia in something like gratitude for bearing witness without glee, and walked out slowly, not triumphant, not gloating, simply finished. The night air met me with the clean honesty of cold, and the limousine door opened with soft hydraulics like a final curtain. As the city lights broke across the tinted window, I allowed myself one last look back, not at her, but at the hall, at the architecture of a lie collapsing under its own math. And I understood with a clarity that didn't feel like victory, so much as balance, that I had never needed to swing anything harder than the truth. The driver asked if he should head out, and I told him yes. And as we pulled away, I felt the quiet settle inside me in a way that did not celebrate destruction but recognized repair, because some revenge is loud, and some is merely the refusal to play the part written for you. And tonight, I had declined the role with a steadiness that finally felt like mine. The limousine hummed through the night, streetlights bending into long streaks across the tinted glass. And for a moment, I thought the story was over. The plan had played out without me needing to force a single scene. The lies had collapsed in front of their own audience, and Melissa had been left clutching air where her triumph was supposed to stand. But endings are strange things. They don't arrive when the curtain drops. They arrive when the silence afterward teaches you something you didn't expect to learn. I sat back, the leather cool against my shoulders, and replayed the evening in slow motion. The whispers, the shattered glass, Daniel's face crumbling under the truth, and instead of the satisfaction I thought would fill me, there was a deeper current pulling at me, something like peace and something like unease tangled together. The driver asked if I wanted to head straight home, but I told him to circle for a while. The city at night is a mirror for moods, and I needed to see mine reflected back. As we moved through the streets, I saw couples stumbling out of bars laughing, people sitting in diner booths sharing stories with greasy plates between them, fragments of ordinary life still intact, and I realized that what had unfolded tonight wasn't only revenge, it was a liberation. I hadn't walked into that hall to prove anything to Melissa. Not really. I had walked in to remind myself I wasn't broken by the narrative she tried to trap me in. And the moment the truth took over, I felt the grip of her shadow fall away in a way that was irreversible. My phone buzzed in my pocket. For a second, I thought about ignoring it, but curiosity tugged. A message glowed on the screen. You played it perfectly. She'll never recover from this. The number wasn't saved, but I knew exactly who it was from. The woman who had walked in, spoken her truth, and detonated the final collapse. I stared at the message, a chill running through me. Had she known I would be there? Had she timed her entrance to align with my toast, my silences, my calm? Or had the universe really stitched two betrayals into the same night? It didn't matter. What mattered was that Melissa had been buried under the weight of her own performance, and I had become the quiet witness the story needed. The driver slowed at a red light, and I caught my reflection in the glass. For months, I had wondered what revenge would look like, whether it would feel like fire, or like triumph, or like some cinematic ending with applause. But it didn't. It felt like clarity, like being able to breathe in a room that had been locked for too long. I hadn't destroyed her. She had done that herself. I had simply made sure there was nowhere left for the lies to hide. The light turned green, and the city kept moving. Yet part of me couldn't shake the thought that the story wasn't quite finished. Melissa would tell a new version of the night tomorrow, one where she was the victim, where I had orchestrated everything, where betrayal had circled back on her unfairly. She would claw at whatever scraps of sympathy she could salvage. But for once, it wouldn't matter. People had seen too much. The image of her dropping that glass, of Daniel storming out, of the truth being named aloud, it was burned into their memory. And you can't rewrite a story once the entire audience has memorized the ending. When the limousine finally pulled up outside my building, I stepped out slowly, the night air sharp in my lungs. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to, listening to the city, to the hum of tires fading, to the quiet that comes after a storm. I thought about the guests who would wake tomorrow replaying the collapse over breakfast, about Daniel pacing somewhere, trying to make sense of promises that never existed, about Melissa staring at herself in the mirror with makeup streaked and wondering how it all slipped so fast. And then I thought about myself, not as her ex, not as the man she tried to disgrace, but as someone who had walked into a fire and left without smelling of smoke. The story didn't end with her ruined wedding or his broken vows. The story ended here, with me closing the door on their chaos and walking upstairs lighter than I'd felt in years. Because revenge isn't always fire. It can be a mirror, a stage, a silence. And sometimes the most satisfying ending is realizing you don't need to push the knife in deeper. You only need to watch them twist on the blade they built for you. And that night, under the streetlights and the empty stars, I knew Melissa would never forget that I hadn't come to play her part. I had come to end the play.